Hi, everyone. So, I'm going to be talking to you about the psychoanalytic lens of literary criticism or critical lens theory. So, the first thing you're probably wondering is what even is critical lens theory? Basically, literary theories are means for us to understand the various ways in which we can read texts. So, all of us as readers bring certain cultural understandings to a text. If you're a man, you might have different thoughts on reading a text than a woman does. If you come from a different country, you might have various thoughts. So, that's why we have lenses to try to understand all of the different ways we can read. So, some quotes from a really great source on critical lens theory. The proponents of each theory believe that their theory is the theory, but most of us interpret texts according to the rules of several different theories at one time. So if you think of how we read a book, we are constantly thinking of all different things. But when you are looking at a text through a lens, you literally want to think about it as putting on a pair of sunglasses and you can only see through a particular view. So in your case, you guys are going to be reading Death of a Salesman through a psychoanalytic lens. So all literary theories, just to elaborate, are lenses through which we can see the text. So, jumping into what even is psychoanalysis. So, Sigmund Freud, I'm sure you've heard that name before. He's the father of psychoanalysis. He had some thoughts on how to treat patients and think about the mind. So, the unconscious, the desires, and the defenses. During psychoanalysis, Freud began treating patients by having them talk freely about their early childhood experiences and dreams. Based on this work, Freud asserted that people's behavior is affected by their unconscious. And a quote from a textbook on literary criticism: the notion that human beings are motivated, even driven by desires, fears, needs, and conflicts of which they are unaware. So that's what the unconscious mind is. Our fears, our desires, our needs, our conflicts, they force us to act in certain ways. And by Freud having his patients just talk freely about things, he came to realize this. Freud believed that our unconscious was influenced by childhood events. So things that you dealt with when you were younger might not really think affected you, but they do. He organized these events into developmental stages involving relationships with parents and drives of desire and pleasure. These stages reflect base levels of desire, but they also involve fear of loss, loss of affection from parents, loss of life, and repression. So I'll jump back to this towards the end, but as you're reading Death of a Salesman, you want to analyze the relationships with parents. So we took a look last week about poems, parent-child dynamics. This is at the base of psychoanalysis. Another note about the stages: these stages reflect how our minds are a dichotomy consisting of the conscious, the rational, and the unconscious, the irrational. So we are constantly battling with what's right versus what might not be right, but some things that we want to do anyway. The unconscious houses two basic instincts: eros, or the sexual instinct, and the destructive and aggressive instinct. So if we think of this again as two different parts: rational, irrational, positive, negative, that's kind of what's going on here. So I have this comic for you guys. I'm going to pause so that you can reflect on how this really relates to the unconscious mind. So for those of you that are visual learners, this might help to explain what we just discussed in the previous slide. All right, so more on the unconscious brain: the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud said that there are three parts: id, ego, superego, and I'm going to break them down for you. The id is the part of the personality that contains our primitive impulses, such as thirst, anger, hunger, and the desire for instant gratification. The id wants whatever feels good at the time, with no consideration for other circumstances. The id is sometimes represented by the devil sitting on someone's shoulder. So if you have seen cartoons where there's an angel and a devil and the person is conflicted, that's what's going on here. So the id is the devil telling us to do things because we desire them. Superego is the part of the personality that represents the conscious, the moral part of us. It dictates our belief of right and wrong. The superego is sometimes represented by an angel sitting on someone's shoulder, telling the ego to base behavior on how the action will influence others. So again, devil, angel. Id is the devil, superego is the angel trying to control us. And then lastly, the third part of the equation is the ego. The ego is the part of the personality that maintains a balance between our impulses, the id and the superego. The ego is based on the reality principle. The ego works, in other words, to balance it, the id and the superego. The ego is represented by a person with a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. So again, if you want to think of it like that, or if you want to think of it as a scale, all right? So the ego kind of balances the id on one side of the scale and the superego on the other side of the scale. All right, so final part of psychoanalysis, and this is a throwback to your freshman year, but the Oedipus complex. So Freud developed something called the Oedipus complex, and if you remember the play, I'm sure you know where this is going. Essentially, the Oedipus complex involves children's need for their parents and the conflict that arises as children mature and realize they are not the absolute focus of their mother's attention. The Oedipus complex takes a different form in males than it does in females. So again, when you're a child, you want the attention, a male child especially, you want the attention of your mother. Oedipus complex is that stage when we realize that, oh no, we aren't the sole desire of the mother. Children, Freud maintained, connect this conflict of attention to the intimate relations between mother and father, relations from which the children are excluded. Freud believed that the result is a murderous rage against the father and a desire to possess the mother. So again, this is children in our subconscious, unconscious mind. We want the mother's attention, so naturally we hate the father because that's the person taking that love away. Freud argued the boy learns to identify with the father in hope of someday possessing a woman like his mother. So that's the developmental stage. When the boy finally realizes, oh wait, maybe I should be like my father because that's how I'll get someone like my mother. Freud believed that the impact of the unconscious id, ego, superego, the defenses, and the Oedipus complexes was inescapable, and that these elements of the mind influence all our behavior, even our dreams as adults. Of course, this behavior involves what we write. So that's where Death of a Salesman comes in. Arthur Miller was not someone who was unaffected by all of these things. He absolutely was. We all are. So naturally, these unconscious desires will come up in his writing. So it's your job to figure out what are some things that he writes about. So here is probably the most important slide. These are the questions you're going to ask for the duration of this unit. So as you are reading Death of a Salesman, you and your group will only be looking through a psychoanalytic lens. First question, how do the operations of repression structure or inform the work? Are there any Oedipal dynamics or any other family dynamics at work here? So absolutely you're going to want to focus on that. The relationships between Biff, Happy, and Linda, the mother. How can a character's behavior, narrative events, and or images be explained in terms of psychoanalytic concepts of any kind? Fear, fascination with death, sexuality, those things are all primary indicators of the id, ego, and superego. What does the work suggest about the psychological being of its author? So again, you might want to do a little bit of research on Arthur Miller. What connections can you make between your knowledge of an author's life and the behavior and motivations of the characters? So does Arthur Miller place himself as any of the characters? We want to look at his biography as we're reading through the play. And then lastly, what might a given interpretation of a literary work suggest about the psychological motives of the reader? So that's where you're going to come in. What are you picking up on, and what is it suggesting about our own psychology? All right, so to make this a little more clear, all of you read 1984 last year as sophomores. So a reading of 1984 through a psychoanalytic lens. If we think of Winston, the main character, does he represent the id or the ego? So to the reader, Winston is the ego, since he is just the average working man. He's kind of that balance. But from a dystopian standpoint, Winston is the id, since he spends most of the novel rebelling against the government. So Winston is just constantly feeding into those desires. He doesn't have the superego saying, oh, let's think about the morals, and he doesn't really have the ego to balance it out. Another example would be unconscious desires in 1984. So, Room 101, we talk a lot about fears with psychoanalysis. That is everyone's biggest fear. 2 minutes hate is another great example. It's just uninhibited rage. Everyone's allowed to kind of express their unconscious desires, and that's coming out during the 2 minutes hate. And then lastly, Winston's diary. Again, another place for him to record all these fears, desires, and longings. So I hope that was helpful. We are going to continue to talk about psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytic lens throughout this unit for Death of a Salesman.